Thank you so much all for joining us this afternoon. I really appreciate your time. As Anna said, my name is Laura Sawyer. I'm actually currently a PhD student at the University of Nottingham, and I led the research on this report. So the following presentation is just going to give you a comprehensive overview of the research and some of our key findings. With any questions, welcome at the end, and you can pop them in the chat as we're going along. So as explained, due to the increasing numbers of potential victims refusing to provide consent to a referral into the NRM, our research intended to explore the key factors which might influence a potential victim's decision to consent to an NRM referral. So aiming to create a greater understanding of these factors, we asked kind of 4 key research questions, which are on here. So firstly, has there been an increase in potential victims choosing not to enter the NRM? What are the key factors which influence the decision of potential victims to not consent to a referral? Have recent changes to policy and legislation had any impact on this decision making? And finally, what support is available for potential victims outside of the NRM should they choose not to enter support? To do this, we adopted a mixed methodology. Firstly, due to a lack of existing research specifically on this topic, we conducted a rapid review of literature exploring the common challenges involved with identifying potential victims of modern slavery. Secondly, to explore the growth of duty to notify reports, we conducted a quantitative comparative analysis on NRM and duty to notify stats between 2016 to 2024. And then alongside this, a heavy focus of the research was placed on qualitative data analysis of the factors which might influence decision making. So firstly, the research benefited from the use of existing data collected within my ongoing PhD study, identifying 34 participant interviews and roundtable data of relevance into this topic specifically. And then secondly, we conducted our own primary interviews and roundtables with an additional 22 participants. So participants consisted of statutory and non-statutory first responder organisations, such as enforcement agencies, local authorities, NGOs, and then we also interviewed a number of non-first responder NGOs as well. So to firstly consider our first research question on whether there has been an increase in potential victims choosing not to enter the NRM, the comparative analysis that we conducted aimed to explore the growth of duty to notify reports and whether the growth has increased proportionally to the overall growth in NRM referrals. So looking at the overall growth in reports between 2016 to 2024, the research found that there has been a 403% increase in NRM referrals, but a 635% increase in duty to notify reports. So with duty to notify reports increasing by an additional 232%, it suggests that duty to notify reports are in fact increasing at a higher rate than the overall growth in NRM referrals. Considering the effect across the total number of potential victims encountered, so combining kind of those identified through the NRM and through duty to notify, the annual data breakdown displays a fluctuating but positive increase in the total number of potential victims encountered who went on to be recorded through the duty to notify report. So with 17% of total potential victims encountered recorded through duty to notify in 2016 and 23% in 2024, there has been again an increase of 6% across the 9-year period. The change can also be observed when assessing the ratio of NRMs completed to duty to notify reports. So in 2016, we can see that there were 5 NRM referrals completed for every 1 duty to notify. And whilst this increased to a height of 8 to 1 in 2019, the ratio rate has decreased again to only 3 to 1 since 2023 and has maintained consistent since then. And finally, we also considered the percentage change in reporting types between the years across this period. So there's 2 specific years I want to quickly highlight. Firstly, since the initial impacts of COVID in 2019 to 2020, which resulted in the percentage decrease you can see across both reporting types, there has continued to be a positive trend in reporting across the NRM and duty to notify reports. However, whilst referrals were expected to continue to arise following COVID, And NRM referrals did increase by 20% between 20 to 2021. Duty to notify reports increased at over double the rate of NRMs in this period. And then the other year of interest highlighted is between 2022 to 2023, as whilst both reporting types continued to have a positive percentage increase, NRM referrals dropped to only a 0.5 increase, and duty to notify reports to an 8% increase, so still remaining at a higher increasing rate than NRM referrals. Considering the increases in both of these years, whilst the increases are not clear in the reason why they've increased, it can be argued that they may be related to the introduction of key legislation around the same time periods. So in 2021, we had the Nationality and Borders Bill announced, and then in 2023, we had the Illegal Migration Bill announced. And with both of these bills, professionals warned of the detrimental impact that they could have on the identification of potential victims and their willingness to engage in NRM support. However, we will explore this more across the presentation. So based on the comparative analysis we conducted, we concluded that the duty to notify reports have increased at a higher rate in comparison to the overall growth rate in the identification of potential victims and NRM referrals, which suggests there are increasing rates of potential victims encountered who are actively choosing to not consent to a referral into the NRM. Before we move on to the factors that might be causing this, I do want to briefly mention some of the findings from our qualitative analysis, which related specifically to the duty to notify process. So across the participants, 88% reported that duty to notify reports are grossly undercompleted and cannot be relied on for an accurate representation of the number of potential victims encountered who refuse entry into the NRM. Different statutory first responders highlighted the challenge of completing duty to notify reports amongst the bureaucracy of so much paperwork, the additional time it takes to complete a duty to notify report, the lack of awareness from professionals of the need to complete a report, and the lack of guidance and training provided on how to do this. When we considered the role of non-statutory first responders, only one NGO first responder reported completing duty to notify reports at all, with all the others emphasising their lack of statutory responsibility to completing these reports. Alongside this, NGOs reported the intentional non-completion of duty to notifies unless a potential victim has specifically provided consent to do so. So despite the duty to notify form being already anonymised, participants felt that providing details on the potential victim's exploitation through the duty to notify form still violates their lack of consent for passing details on to the Home Office through an NRM referral. Furthermore, the duty to notify data was also perceived to be unrepresentative due to the inability of non-first responders to complete duty to notify reports when encountering a potential victim. Also, just to consider the purpose of the duty to notify reports, 14% of participants questioned the overall purpose of the duty to notify within the interviews and roundtables. And participants reported that the duty to notify has no use outside of providing statistics to the Home Office, and they highlighted the lack of benefit for potential victims should a report actually be completed. And then finally, across the primary data collection of the 22 additional participants, 7 reported data keeping outside of the NRM and duty to notify process. So they recorded details on those who entered the NRM and those who did not. And this data records often surpassed data collected through the duty to notify procedure. So recording logs of age, gender, nationality, and exploitation type. Some also recorded details such as perpetrator details, methods of control, type of recruitment, location of exploitation and industry, minutes of meetings, and reasons for refusing consent to an NRM referral. When describing why they were keeping their own records, participants said that it was a way of monitoring the support needs and outcomes of a potential victim, but also as a really important method for justifying the resourcing within their own services. To address our second research question, the following section, we're going to look at the key factors that emerge from our qualitative analysis, which may influence potential victim decision-making with regards to consent to enter the NRM. So the first selection of findings discussed within the report and identified here were some of also the ones most highlighted across literature and related to factors which really affect the potential victim as an individual. So due to the vast amount of knowledge on the school, I'm not going to spend too long going into each of these, and we'll just briefly mention them. So I would encourage you to read the full report for more detail on these areas if you're interested. So firstly, with fear of immigration repercussions, it's commonly understood that many victims are moved across international borders under the control of traffickers, with them holding the victim's identification documents and maintaining control through the lack of legal immigration status. Therefore, it wasn't surprising that 48% of participants reported that the fear of immigration repercussions were the most reported reason by potential victims when refusing consent to the NRM. They discussed instances of potential victims having been warned of deportation by their exploiters, of being told that entering the NRM would have a negative impact on their asylum claim, and the general lack of trust that the immigration system is not designed to catch them out. 38% of participants discussed the unwillingness of potential victims to engage in police investigations due to the fear of repercussions, potential fear of not being believed by authorities, and cultural shame if found to have reported to the police. And participants also attributed this fear of authorities to the experiences of corrupt authorities within other countries. With the challenge of self-identification, it's acknowledged that the psychological harm that victims experience through their exploitation often makes potential victims unable to recognise the true nature of their circumstance or to acknowledge that they are in fact victims of exploitation. And 23% of our participants highlighted the challenge that many potential victims experience in self-identification due to the inability to resonate with the language of exploitation, the belief that potential victims consented to their own exploitation, cultural differences in the expectations of working conditions, cultural shame, and the attachment or relational ties to their exploiter. And then finally, where we've talked about fear of repercussions, 21% of participants highlighted the impact that the fear of repercussions from their exploiters can have on potential victim engagement, with participants reporting that the fear of retribution on family members significantly outweighs the potential victim's desire for individual protection and support. A key theme emerging from our research was the inconsistent description of the NRM. So when asked how the NRM is described to potential victims, 5 participants immediately highlighted the difficulty of describing the NRM. So whilst 8 participants referenced the use of existing resources to aid their description, such as set scripts or multi-agency leaflets in the government website, 14 participants each described taking a different approach to discussing the NRM with potential victims, with several recognising the impact that the lack of consistency in the approaches taken by professionals may have on the potential victim understanding of what the NRM is. Whilst all participants outlined the general process of the reasonable and conclusive grounds decision and the positive benefits of the NRM, 5 participants highlighted their purposeful inclusion of the potential consequences of a referral into the NRM for a potential victim. So these consequences related to the timescales surrounding decision making, the lack of access to the NRM should they not be able to provide sufficient evidence, and the possible impact on a potential victim's immigration status. So these participants felt very strongly that potential victims should be given all of the information possible to have a realistic understanding of NRM support and to make an informed decision. But they did recognise that these consequences may also impact their decision to not pursue an NRM referral if they hear about the consequences. So likewise, following from the inconsistent description of the NRM, 48% of participants then highlighted the challenge that potential victims face in understanding the NRM. So whilst not explored more across this research in depth, 68% of participants felt that even for those who do consent to an NRM referral, the challenge of the lack of understanding often results in a lack of truly informed consent obtained for an NRM referral. So there was a number of factors identified as contributing to the lack of understanding of the NRM, but I've highlighted just 3 of the key contributing factors here. So the first around the impact of trauma on comprehension of understanding. So again, supporting existing understandings of the impact of trauma on cognition, 30% of participants highlighted the impact that trauma can have on potential victim comprehension and the retention of information surrounding the NRM. Participants reported that potential victims are often in their most vulnerable state when they are offered a referral into the NRM, and as a result are not in the physical or emotional position to understand the information they are presented with or to effectively articulate the support that they need. Participants reported that despite having an explanation of the NRM provided, the combination of the significant amount of information, the complexity of the decision-making process and evidence required, and this vulnerable position that many potential victims are in at the time of the encounter, results in potential victims being unable to understand or retain the purpose and process of the NRM. So therefore, participants felt that many potential victims are unlikely to consent to a referral if they do not understand the system itself. Secondly, 30% of participants highlighted examples of potential victims refusing consent due to misinformation and poor communication. Participants reported instances of potential victims hearing reports that a referral would have a negative impact on their asylum process, hearing the negative experiences of peers who'd previously left the NRM due to a lack of support, the impact of court proceedings, or the delay on life due to timescales. And they also reported instances of poor and fraudulent advice given to potential victims from immigration solicitors themselves. And finally, 26% of participants highlighted the barrier created by terminology. So participants felt that the name of the National Referral Mechanism itself can be a barrier, reporting that the NRM is a term that is too harsh and clunky, and it actually adds to the level of fear that potential victims may be experiencing at this point of contact. Additionally, the terms modern slavery, human trafficking, and exploitation were highlighted due to the challenge of these terms resonating with potential victims' experiences. So this was particularly prevalent for foreign nationals, where 30% of participants raised the issue of potential victims not understanding these concepts due to cultural differences and terms just not translating into other languages at all. And another final key theme that emerged across the research was this questionable benefit of the NRM, with 50% of participants raising the issue of whether the NRM is truly beneficial for every potential victim. So out of 28 participants, only one reported that the NRM is universally beneficial for all potential victims. Again, multiple factors were felt to contribute to this, and so I've highlighted the most prevalent of these here, but there are a further list within the report. So 37% of participants highlighted the difference that nationality makes when assessing if the NRM is the best outcome for a potential victim. Despite British nationals making up the largest nationality represented in the NRM, participants reported that the NRM is not designed for or effectively prepared to support British victims of modern slavery. Participants felt that British potential victims often choose not to pursue a referral into the NRM as they can receive access to services through their local authority and a range of other agencies, meaning that there is seen to be no essential benefit from an NRM referral for a British national. Secondly, 30% of participants reported that the NRM has no tangible benefits beyond the recognition by the government as a survivor. Participants felt that aside from the offer of support and some financial assistance, there is little benefit to a potential victim, highlighting the lack of impact that the NRM has on immigration status, the lack of safe move-on options post-NRM, and the ability of potential victims to access support from organisations outside of the NRM process. And as a result, participants reported that potential victims often refuse consent on the recognition that there is nothing to be gained from a referral. Whilst recognising increases in the speed of decision-making surrounding the reasonable grounds decision, 25% of participants still highlighted the reluctance of potential victims to provide consent when they were made aware of timescales surrounding decision-making. So participants highlighted that potential victims don't want to place their entire life on hold for a number of years. And as a result, participants reported increasing instances of foreign nationals weighing up entering the NRM or pursuing asylum based on humanitarian grounds, basing their decision on whichever route would be quickest in the end. And finally, 25% of participants reported that potential victims believe they will be better off remaining in exploitation. So it was reported that whilst many potential victims realise they are being exploited, due to their need to work, potential victims perceive exploitation to be a better option than the alternative of entering the NRM without the ability to work, to pay off debts, or to send financial remittances to family members overseas. And in these instances, the benefit of the NRM was said to be outweighed by the benefit of income, albeit in exploitative circumstances. So exploring our third research question, the qualitative analysis also explored the influence that recent legislation and other policy changes, such as the Nationality and Borders Act, the Illegal Migration Act, and the increased evidence threshold in statutory guidance have had on the decision of potential victims to enter the NRM. So out of 33 participants who discussed the impact of recent policy and legislation, 27 participants reported a definite or potential impact, while 6 participants reported no impact at all. So I want to quickly consider the positionality of these participants in this response. So of the 27 who reported an impact on potential victim willingness to engage with the NRM, 21 of the 27 participants worked for an NGO, whereas in comparison, of the 6 participants who reported no impact, 4 out of the 6 worked for an enforcement agency. Across those who reported no impact, participants reported that it's too much of a stretch to believe that potential victims would even be aware of recent legislation changes, claiming that the legislation is too complex, that language barriers would prevent potential victims from being aware of the asylum system in general, and that potential victims should actually see the NRM as being more beneficial in light of legislation changes. So with this, they reported that the NRM is a means of bypassing the system and avoiding deportation. In contrast, just to highlight some of the reported impacts, again, due to time restraints, I'm not wanting to hold you all day, I'm not going to read through the entire list of reported impacts from recent legislation and policy, as I would again encourage you to read the full report later today to get better insight into these areas. However, on this slide, you can see the range of impacts reported by participants, with the percentage of participants raising each of these in the corresponding column. So whilst distinct factors to some degree, many of these factors were reported to result in potential victims' refusal to consent due to the disincentive for potential victims to identify themselves to the Home Office, the fear of disbelief, the lack of protection that the NRM provides against deportation, the lack of trust in government and the entire immigration system, and the trickling down of government rhetoric into the professional behaviours and attitudes of professionals who then encounter potential victims. But I'm not going to speak any more on that, so please go away and read the report for more detail. And then finally, our last research question explored what support is available to a potential victim if they do not enter the NRM. So again, showing a full list of support options raised by participants here, with the amount of participants specifically highlighting each of these in the corresponding column. With knowledge on this call, I'm not going to spend time going through what each of these support types are or what they offer in terms of support, but I just want to highlight a couple of things in particular. So whilst 42% of participants discussed support options outside of the NRM, 10 participants reported instances where there was no further support given to a potential victim. So these participants attributed the lack of support as the result of potential victims choosing to disengage. However, they did recognise that in those cases, they still signposted potential victims to other types of support should they wish to engage at a later point. So there was still options presented. It was just that at that moment, potential victims did not feel like they wanted to pursue it. In terms of then the support options identified on the slide, the second one on here, unspecified support, actually refers to instances where participants discussed referring potential victims to other agencies, but they didn't specifically name the organisation. And so these were cases in which potential victims did go on to receive support, but I could not categorise them into the same list simply due to a lack of information. But they are obviously remaining areas where people did receive support. And then finally, whilst again further down the list, I do want to quickly highlight the multi-agency and wraparound support on the list. So of the 5 participants who reported using a multi-agency approach, 3 participants were from local authorities with specific multi-agency panels set within a framework for providing support for potential victims. So these participants reported that on identification of a potential victim, the multi-agency panel will identify all support needs and provide wraparound support to try and meet those needs prior to an NRM referral even being discussed with a potential victim. So this was an example of really good practice for ensuring that potential victims receive the support that they need, regardless of an NRM referral. However, participants did recognise that through the provision of wraparound support prior to the NRM referral, this may actually also lead to potential victims not consenting to a referral when asked, as potential victims at that point then don't believe that an NRM referral would be of any additional benefit at that point. So just to conclude, as you've heard, the research has identified quite a number of factors which influence the decision of potential victims to not consent to a referral into the NRM, suggesting also that recent policy and legislation has had a detrimental impact on the engagement of potential victims when considering a referral into the NRM. The research also confirmed that duty to notify reports are increasing at higher rates in comparison to the overall growth of referrals, suggesting that there are more instances of potential victims actively choosing not to consent to a referral. And despite this, the research found that there are a range of support options available for potential victims outside of the NRM, meaning that potential victims are not left without any other support options should they not pursue an NRM referral. As a result, the research has made a number of recommendations. So this list also incorporates a number of recommendations as suggested by participants across the data collection. So firstly, the NRM must provide the services and benefits promoted through a comprehensive review of the experiences of those within it. This review should aim to reform the NRM to ensure that potential victims are able to experience the full benefit of a referral, regardless of nationality, and should rebuild the confidence that a referral into the NRM is in the best interest of a potential victim. Secondly, all first responders must receive standardised training to ensure that potential victims receive a consistent and comprehensive explanation of the NRM. This explanation must include all information regarding the benefits and the potential consequences of an NRM referral to ensure that a potential victim is able to make a fully informed decision. Thirdly, the UK government must recommit to providing pre-NRM safe spaces to ensure that a trauma-informed approach is taken when engaging with potential victims. This will offer immediate support and safety for individuals escaping situations of exploitation and give them the necessary time needed to consider their decision about entering the NRM. Next, the UK government must do more to decouple modern slavery within immigration. Whilst the Labour government has recently transferred the remit of modern slavery to the Safeguarding Minister, more must be done to challenge the encroaching hostile environment and to protect potential victims of modern slavery from immigration detention and deportation. As Eleanor mentioned at the beginning, the duty to notify reporting must also be made mandatory across all first responder organisations to aid a more comprehensive identification of potential victims in the UK. But this must be supported by clear guidance and clear training on the purpose of duty to notify data and the specific information required in duty to notify reports. And with that, the UK government must also reassess the use of duty to notify data and how data can be better recorded and accessed in order to improve professional practice and facilitate the prevention of modern slavery and human trafficking. And finally, further survivor-led research should be conducted, speaking directly with survivors and potential victims to explore their experiences firsthand and build on the findings of this research with professionals and first responders. So we've come to the end of the presentation. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you found this insightful, and I look forward to any questions.